2 Samuel 18. David counted the people who were with him and appointed over them officers of thousands and officers of hundreds. David then sent the people away, a third under the hand of Joab, a third under the hand of Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and a third under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. The king then said to the people, I shall also go forth with you. But the people said, You should not go forth. For if we will have to flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us, even if we would be 10,000 times as many as we are. So now it is better that you help us from the city. The king replied to them, Whatever is best in your eyes, I shall do. So the king stayed near the gate, while all the people went forth by their hundreds and thousands. The king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, For my sake, be gentle with the boy Absalom. And the people all heard as the king commanded all the officers concerning Absalom. The people went out to the field toward the army of Israel. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The people of Israel were defeated by David's servants. The casualties were heavy on that day, 20,000. The battle spread out from there all across the land. The forest consumed more people than the sword consumed on that day. Absalom chanced upon David's servants. Absalom was riding upon a mule, and the mule came under the thick branches of a large elm tree. His head became entangled in the elm, and he was suspended between the heavens and the earth, while the mule that was under him moved on. One man saw and told Joab. He said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging from an elm. Joab then said to the man who had told him, And if you saw this, why did you not strike him there, down to the ground? I would have been obligated to reward you with 10 silver pieces and 1 belt. The man said to Joab, Even if I were weighing out 1,000 silver pieces upon my hands, I would not send forth my hand against the king's son. For in our own earshot the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, Whoever finds him, take care of the boy of Absalom. Even if I had acted deceitfully on my own, nothing remains hidden from the king, and you would stand aside. Joab then said, I will not beg you any more. He then took 3 staves in his hand and thrust them into Absalom's heart. Yet he was still alive, and in the midst of the elm, 10 soldiers, the armor-bearers of Joab, circled around and beat Absalom and killed him. Joab then blew the shofar, and the people refrained from chasing after Israel, for Joab restrained the people. They took Absalom's body and threw it in the forest, into the great pit, and they erected a very large mound of stones. Meanwhile, all of Israel fled, each man to his tent. Absalom had undertaken in his lifetime and erected for himself the pillar that is in the valley of the king. For he said, I have no son. This is in order that my name should be remembered. He called the pillar by his name, and it is called Absalom's monument until this day. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, I shall run and tell the king the news, that Hashem has granted him justice from his enemies. But Joab told him, You should not be the bearer of news today. You can bring news another day, but do not bring news today, for the king's son is dead. Joab then said to the Cushite, Go, tell the king what you have seen. And the Cushite prostrated himself to Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, continued to persist and said to Joab, Whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. But Joab said, Why should you run, my son? This news will not provide any benefit for you. Whatever happens, let me run. So he said to him, Run. Ahimaaz ran by the route of the plain and overtook the Cushite. David was sitting between the 2 gates of the city. The lookout went up to the roof of the gate to the wall. He raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running alone. The lookout called out and told the king. The king said, If he is alone, there's news in his mouth. And he kept drawing closer. Then the lookout saw another man running. The lookout called out to the gatekeeper and said, Behold, another man is running alone. The king said, This man is also a herald. The lookout said, I recognize the first one's stride as the stride of Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. And the king said, He is a good man. He is coming with good news. Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, Peace! And he prostrated himself to the king with his face to the ground. Then he said further, Blessed is Hashem your God, who has delivered into our hands the men who lifted up their hand against my lord the king." The king then asked, "Is it well with the boy Absalom?" Ahimaaz replied, "I saw the great commotion when Joab sent the Cushite servant of the king and myself, your servant, and I do not know what happened." The king then said, "Move aside and stand here." So he moved aside and stood. Then behold, at that point the Cushite arrived. The Cushite said, "Let my lord the king be informed that Hashem has granted you justice today from all those who rose up against you." Then the king asked the Cushite, "Is it well with the boy Absalom?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king be like the boy, as well as all others who rise up against you to do you harm." 2 Samuel 19. The king trembled. He ascended to the upper chamber of the gateway and wept. And thus he said as he went, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I could have died in your place. Absalom, my son, my son." It was told to Joab, "Behold, the king is crying and lamenting over Absalom." The salvation of that day was transformed to mourning for all the people, for the people heard it said on that day, "The king is saddened over his son." The people stole themselves into the city on that day, as those people who are ashamed would steal away when they run from the battle. The king wrapped his face, and the king cried out in a loud voice, "My son, Absalom! Absalom, my son, my son!" Joab then came to the king into the chamber and said, "Today you have humiliated the faces of all your servants who saved your soul, and the soul of your sons and daughters, and the soul of your wives, and the soul of your concubines, by expressing love for those who hate you, and hatred for those who love you. For you have declared today that you do not have officers or servants. For today I know that were Absalom alive and all of us dead today, it would be preferable in your eyes. So now arise and go out. Speak to the hearts of your servants, for I swear by Hashem that if you do not go out, no man will stay to spend the night with you. And this will be worse for you than any harm that has ever come upon you from your youth until this day." So the king arose and sat at the city gate. They told all the people, saying, "Behold, the king is sitting at the gate." And all the people came before the king. Meanwhile, the army of Israel had run away, each man to his tents. Then it happened that all the people among all the tribes of Israel were debating, saying, "The king rescued us from the hand of our enemies, and he delivered us from the hand of the Philistines. Now he has fled from the land from before Absalom, and Absalom, who we had anointed over us, has died in the battle. And now, why are you silent regarding bringing back the king?" King David then sent a message to Zadok and Abiathar, the Kohanim, saying, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why should you be the last to return the king to his house? The word of all of Israel has come to the king, to return him to his house. You are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. So why should you be last to return the king?" And to Amasa say, "Are you not my bone and my flesh? Such may God do to me, and such may he do further, if I do not make you commander of the army before me always, in place of Joab." Amasa thus turned the hearts of all the men of Judah as one man, and they sent a message to the king, "Return, you and all your servants." So the king returned, and he reached the Jordan, and the people of Judah came to Gilgal to go and greet the king, to escort him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite who was from Bahurim, hastened and went down with the men of Judah to greet King David. With him were 1,000 men from Benjamin, and Seba, the attendant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and 20 servants. And they forded the Jordan to go before the king. When the ferry crossed over to bring across the household of the king and do whatever was proper in his eyes, Shimei, son of Gera, fell before the king as he was crossing in the Jordan. He said to the king, "Let my lord not consider it an iniquity for me, and do not remember that which your servant sinned on the day when my master the king left Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. For your servant knows that I have sinned, and here I have come today, first among all the house of Joseph, to come down and greet my master the king." Abishai, son of Zeruiah, then spoke up and said, Shall Shimei not be put to death despite this apology? For he has cursed the anointed one of Hashem." David then said, "What does it matter to me or to you, O sons of Zeruiah, that you should be an adversary unto me today? Shall a man of Israel be put to death today, that you should be an adversary unto me today? Shall a man of Israel be put to death today? For do I not know that today I am king over Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king swore to him. Mephibosheth, son of Saul, came down to greet the king. He had not bathed his feet and had not trimmed his mustache. He had not laundered his clothing from the day the king left until the day that he returned in peace. And it happened that when he came to Jerusalem to greet the king, that the king said to him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He replied, "My lord, the king, my servant Ziba tricked me. For your servant said, 'I shall saddle up the donkey and ride upon it and go with the king,' for your servant is lame. He then slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God. Do whatever is proper in your eyes. For my entire father's family was nothing but condemned men before my lord the king. And yet you placed your servant among those who eat at your table. So what further justification have I to cry out further to the king?" The king then said to him, "Why do you still speak your words? I hereby declare that you and Ziba should divide the property." Mephibosheth replied to the king, "Let him take it all, since my lord the king has arrived safely to his house." Barzillai of Gilead came down from Roglim, and he crossed the Jordan with the king to see him off at the Jordan. Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had sustained the king when he dwelt in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "You cross over with me, and I shall sustain you with me in Jerusalem." But Barzillai said to the king, "How many are the days remaining of the years of my life that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I'm 80 years old today. Can I distinguish good from bad? Does your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I still hear the sound of male or female singers? Why then should your servant be a burden any longer on my lord the king? I will accompany the king across the Jordan for a bit, but why should the king reward me with his benefit? Let your servant return, and I will die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. Behold, your servant Chimham will cross with my lord the king. Do with him what is proper in your eyes." The king said, "Chimham will cross with me, and I shall do for him what is proper in your eyes. Anything you choose for me, I shall do for you." All the people then crossed the Jordan, and the king crossed. The king kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his place. The king crossed over to Gilgal, and Chimham crossed over with him. All the people of Judah brought the king across, and also part of the people of Israel. Then, behold, all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, "Why have our brethren, the men of Judah, abducted you? They have brought the king and his household across the Jordan, and all of David's men with him." And all the men of Judah, as one, answered the men of Israel, "Because the king is related to me. Why then are you angry over this matter? Have we partaken of the king's food? Has he granted us special portions?" But the men of Israel, as one, answered the men of Judah and said, "I have 10 times as much share in the king. Though he be David, I have more than you do. So why do you slight me? Was it not my initiative to bring back my king?" But the words of the men of Judah were harsher than the words of the men of Israel. 2 Samuel 20. There happened to be there a certain base man by the name of Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite. He sounded the shofar and said, "We have no part in David. We have no heritage in the son of Jesse. Every man back to his tents, O Israel." So all the men of Israel went up from behind David and followed Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah clung to their king from the Jordan to Jerusalem. David arrived at his house in Jerusalem. The king took the 10 concubine wives whom he had left behind to keep the house and put them up in a guarded house and sustained them. But he no longer lived with them. They were bound up in living widowhood until the day they died. The king then said to Amasa, "Muster for me the men of Judah within the next 3 days, and you also stand here then." So Amasa went to muster the men of Judah, but he was late for the appointed time which the king had set for him. David then said to Abishai, "Now Sheba son of Bichri will do more harm to us than Absalom. So you take your lord's servants yourself and chase after him, lest he find himself some fortified cities and rescue himself before our eyes." Joab's men went after him, as well as the archers and the slingers and all the mighty men. They left Jerusalem to chase after Sheba son of Bichri. When they were at the great stone that is in the Gibeon, Amasa was coming toward them. Joab was girded with his battle garments, and he had a sword girded upon himself, which was fastened upon his loins in its scabbard. And as he moved forward, it fell out. Joab then said to Amasa, "Is all well with you, my brother?" And Joab's right hand grabbed hold of Amasa's beard to kiss him. Amasa was not vigilant of the sword in Joab's left hand, and he struck him with it into his fifth rib, and spilled his innards out onto the ground. He did not need to repeat the blow, and he died. Joab and his brother Abishai then took up the chase after Sheba son of Bichri. A man, one of Joab's attendants, stood over Amasa and said, "Whoever approves of Joab and whoever is for David, follow Joab." But Amasa was wallowing in blood in the middle of the road, and the man saw that all the people stood still. So he moved Amasa from the road into the field and threw a garment over him, when he saw that everyone who came to it stood still. Once he was removed from the road, all the men passed and followed Joab to chase after Sheba son of Bichri. He passed through all the tribes of Israel, to Abel and to Beth-Makkah and to all the Berites. They gathered together, and they too followed him. They came and besieged him at Abel Beth-Makkah. They poured a ramp against the city until it remained secure through the inner wall. And all the people who were with Joab began demolishing, to topple the main wall. A wise woman called out from the city, "Listen, listen! Please say to Joab, 'Come close to here, so that I may speak to you.' So he drew close to her, and the woman said, 'Are you Joab?' He replied, 'I am.' She said, 'Hear the words of your maidservant.' And he said, 'I am listening.' She spoke on, saying, 'Your men should have spoken at the start, saying, Let them inquire in Abel about surrender, for they would have made peace. I represent the loyal, faithful people of Israel. You are seeking to annihilate a city and a metropolis in Israel. Why would you swallow up the heritage of Hashem?' Joab answered and said, 'Far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. The matter is not so. Rather, a man from Mount Ephraim, his name is Sheba, son of Bichri, has raised up his hand against the king, against David. Turn over him alone, and I will go away from the city.' The woman then said to Joab, 'Behold, his head will be thrown to you over the wall.' In her wisdom, the woman then went to all the people, and they cut off the head of Sheba son of Bichri, and threw it to Joab. He sounded the shofar, and they all disbanded from the city, every man to his tents. And Joab then returned to Jerusalem, to the king. Joab was commander of the entire army of Israel, with Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, over the archers and the slingers, Adoram over the tax, Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, the chronicler, Shiva, the scribe, Sadok and Abiathar, the Kohanim, and also Ira the Jairite was a Cohen unto David. Welcome back. This is the NQE number 139. We're reading 2 Samuel chapters 18 through 20. So, in sort of a fantastic way, Absalom, representing Israel, falls by the hand of David's servants. But the king is asking for his servants to take it easy on his son who has usurped his throne, caused a civil war, a rift, this whole issue. Joab, of all the people, does not offer any kind of mercy whatsoever. Instead, Joab renders direct justice. This guy, Absalom, so sorry. He has to die. So once again, I'm seeing Joab acting in a way that is good and that makes sense and is maybe like trying to look out for the throne. Is he a terrible person? Joab hunts down Absalom. He hunts down this other crazy guy, Sheba, son of Bichri. These guys, they are the enemies of the king. And Joab is the general of the army, and this is the royal guard. The enemies of the king, they've got to go. I think those are the rules. Well, you know that something was off. This guy, he tells David that his son is gone. he goes maybe a little bit too far. And Joab, yet, once again, goes up to David. It's like, David, you got to get it together, man. He is the one who's telling David legit, you have got to get this thing together because the way you're acting is bananas. And these people, they're not going to fight for you if you keep acting this way. I wonder if David mourns as greatly as he does for Absalom, because he realizes that now it is absolutely too late for him to generate any kind of real and honest reconciliation. He had a couple of opportunities there, but, he was mad. So David, he didn't extend to this guy Absalom like total unconditional forgiveness. Yeah, it doesn't matter what you did. That's hard to do. David definitely has been the recipient of forgiveness, but not necessarily without its punishment. Absalom just simply represents the punishment from what David did. Not so much anything other than that. Nevertheless, it's a tough role penned out for Absalom to have to play. The beautiful son who usurps his father's throne and is later pretty brutally killed and essentially just thrown into the field. Poor guy. Yet maybe he felt pretty good about himself. He builds a monument with his name. Who does that? The morally fluid elders, they all come together and they say, well, geez, you know what, David, he really did protect us. But we put Absalom in power. Now, here's what I'm asking. These elders, they send a note to David. David, you're the king, take your throne. David then sends notice to his brothers in Judah, and he's like, hey, brothers, these other guys, they're going to beat you to the punch. You need to restore me to the throne. Why does he do this? It causes a rift. They don't like it. All of these brothers from the tribes of Israel, they are not happy that the people of Judah brought the king back to cross the river into Jerusalem. Why? What is the great offense that has happened here? And who is Sheba, son of Bichri, that this whole group of people just simply abandons David? Once more, let's have another war. And why do all of these people come from the tribe of Benjamin? This is what it looks for violence to never cease from the household of David. He's got now a couple of sons dead. Concubines have been disgraced, but David has been restored to the throne, so is that the end of the punishment? Hey, one more episode of the Samuel books remain. Thank you for watching. The NQE is out.